Hey guys, it's the Melblade 5, and across my time making these conceptualizing videos, there's been one fighting game series that has been requested for this treatment repeatedly.
Marvel VS Capcom!
What was probably a strange idea on paper of having the X-Men face off against Street Fighter characters that later expanded to the entirety of Marvel Comics and Capcom's game library ended up becoming one of the biggest, most hype-inducing crossovers of all time, with an incredibly dedicated competitive scene to this day. Despite the hardships the series has experienced over the past decade, with Disney's dumb business decisions almost ending it outright, only for when they U-turned to be followed by Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, which was so underwhelming due to its lackluster roster, presentation, and story mode, that it may have ended up killing the series once and for all after how poorly it sold, with no word on the series since then. But fans still hold a tiny shred of hope in their hearts that maybe one day, despite all the odds, we could end up getting a proper Marvel vs. Capcom 4 like everybody has wanted for so long, leading to many people coming up with their own ideas for what this fabled potential sequel could be like if it did happen. Which became the inspiration for me making that Persona 5 Arena video that unintentionally spawned the other ones as I came up with more ideas. And now it's my turn. Originally, I was never planning on doing this concept because I felt that all my ideas at the time were identical to various others, so I would just be copying them. But now I think I've come up with just enough original ideas to add on so that this video can stand out in its own right, giving me the motivation to finally do this. I don't think I really need to say more on the background to all this beyond what I've already laid out, and it mostly speaks for itself anyway. So let's get on with this. Before we get to the part everybody really cares about, we first need to know which version of the combat system we are using. And this doesn't require much explanation either. We're going back to 3v3, including assists. People didn't mind the switch back to 2v2 in Infinite, but I think the general consensus is that 3v3 is the preferred format. Plus, I think this will be a good way of showing right off the bat that this game is more of a return to form for the series after the missteps that Infinite took. But I don't want to completely scrap Infinite's features, as I think it did have some positives. I would like to bring back the active switch mechanic in some form, but obviously with more restrictions on it now that 3v3 and assists are back. And I also want to carry over a semblance of the Infinity Stone mechanic, specifically the Infinity Storm for how it was used as a comeback mechanic. I thought of it essentially being the same as X Factor from Free, but that you'd also get to choose an additional minor effect on top of the usual attack boost and health regeneration for some strategy. However, I really don't have an exact idea for what those minor effects could be and how to balance them so we don't get any that are clearly better than others like the Soul Stone. But I still wanted to put that out there. Now is when we get to the main draw of these games. The roster. For its size, I ended up deciding on 48 characters, the same as Ultimate Free's base roster. Probably not as large as people would like, but I did this so that it is a noticeable increase from Infinite's smaller roster, while not being too big that it would start to become unrealistic to develop. And out of this roster, 3/4 are returning characters. So doing the maths gives us 12 newcomers. Also not as much as people would like, but it's still more than what Infinite gave us in its entire lifespan. And this was because there were so many characters that I felt needed to return for various reasons. And keep in mind that the returning characters won't all simply be ported over like with Infinite. Where appropriate, mainly with Capcom, they will be updated with alterations to their movesets and or given their most recent appearances. And there will be slightly more Marvel veterans, due to how iconic many of them are now to the point that we simply can't not include them, and having to bring back the X-Men and Fantastic Four characters now that they are no longer being treated as the black sheep of the Marvel universe. Plus, these games have never had an even split of newcomers from each company before, so it's not like I'm breaking tradition here. For the returning characters, from Marvel, we have Spider-Man, Captain America, Iron Man, Hulk, Thor, Black Widow, Hawkeye, Doctor Strange, Captain Marvel, Black Panther, Winter Soldier, Rocket, with Groot in his moveset again, Wolverine, Storm, Deadpool, Magneto, Doctor Doom, and Thanos with his infinite moveset. And for Capcom, we have Ryu, Chun-Li, Akuma, Morrigan, Jeddah, X, Zero, Sigma, Dante, Virgil, Wesker, Strider, Arthur, Captain Commando, Frank West, Phoenix Wright, and Monster Hunter. Now onto who is making up the 12 newcomers in this game's base roster. Starting with Marvel again, and for its first newcomer, if you've seen any of my old and bad videos on Infinite, then you probably saw this coming. Star-Lord. He was my most wanted character for that game, but there's no personal bias in his inclusion here. This time, it's purely because he's the most logical choice for another Guardian of the Galaxy. And with how iconic the Guardians have become thanks to the films, getting another character is warranted. They did do that in Infinite, but they went with Gamora. And not to bash on Gamora or anything, but I always found it very weird putting her in over Star-Lord when he's, you know, the leader of the group. And I got the impression her inclusion was more due to her connection to Thanos than for her independent qualities. So Star-Lord is acting as her replacement for the Guardians rep, but more due to roster size. If I had a bigger roster, I would have brought back Gamora too. But for how he'd play, as you guessed, the majority of his moves would revolve around his blasters, making him more of a zoner character, using standard and rapid fire shots as well as their elemental variations from the comics and video games like ice and electricity to halt opponents. He'd also have access to his jet boots, allowing him to briefly hover in the air to make performing aerial moves much easier. And as I said back then, for his level 3 hyper combo, he'll call in the Milano to initiate an airstrike on the stage. Now we're going to ignore the guns and focus more on the deadly hands of Kung Fu for the next newcomer, Shang-Chi. After his own film gave him a great deal of notoriety to people like me who had never even heard of the character before then, along with being one of the better Phase 4 projects after No Way Home, he ended up leaning more towards being a likely inclusion for this kind of game. Furthermore, what helped to seal the deal for me was how he could act as an in-game rival for Ryu, both thematically and in the marketing, due to that dedication to martial arts, with him being the replacement for Iron Fist as the Marvel martial artist, as his moveset would be almost entirely composed of moves replicating real-life Kung Fu. That ironically gives him some originality when compared to the super-powered, magical, or tech-savvy characters making up most of the remainder of the Marvel side. But for some variety, they can also give him a few moves where he uses the 10 rings, since I learned he does use them in the comics. That wasn't just something they gave him for the film, with it being easy potential for his level 3 to throw a combination of their mystical comic abilities at the opponent all at once. Next up, with a Marvel character whose inclusion, for once, is not primarily influenced by the MCU. Yet. Blade. Instead, it was primarily due to how popular he is with a lot of the hardcore comic readers and those who've seen the original films, making him one of the most well-known characters from the darker horror side of the Marvel Universe. To the point that, back in the day, I recall seeing a fair number of people wanting him to be playable in a Marvel vs. Capcom game, especially after they dangled him in front of our faces in Jill's ending in 3. And with him now making his way to the MCU, after recruiting Jon Snow, it could be the tiniest extra push he needed to finally, possibly get in if this game did happen. Also, his moveset is another one that's pretty self-explanatory just from looking at his action scenes. He'd mainly fight using his swords, but would have some special moves involving the use of his guns. But as he fights with those weapons in pretty different ways to the likes of Dante and Deadpool, he'll still stand out. Plus, he has some additional unique weapons like throwing glaives and projectile stakes to help him stand out further, alongside the obvious opportunities to have him interact with the Devil May Cry and Darkstalkers characters. They can fit right into the roster, even if none of his opponents are going to be vampires. Moving back to the lighthearted side to counterbalance the dark and serious with the next character, and another predictable one too, Miss Marvel. In a similar situation to Blade, she was already a very popular and well-liked hero with comic readers, who now has the bonus of mainstream recognition from her own series, that will then continue on in the Marvels to increase her chances of getting in, where she'd pretty much be simping for Carol the entire time. And the other heroes too. And probably a bunch of the Capcom characters. Okay, pretty much everyone! She's also a character I can imagine Marvel pushing for her inclusion for, let's just say, Reasons that don't have anything to do with why Kamala is liked by comic readers. But as the reasons why she is liked still exist, she'd still be a good choice. Not to mention how distinct her moveset would be, since she'll have her comic powers with her polymorphism, rather than that Green Lantern copy stuff from the show. Allowing her to stretch her body and make those parts bigger, meaning the Fantastic Four unfortunately get the shaft once again. This would give her a mix of long-range light attacks like Dalsim, and heavy attacks with large hitboxes. And an idea I had for one of her hyper combos would be a callback to Jin's with the giant robot arm, where she makes her hand gigantic and punches you with it. And for the final Marvel character in the base roster, Loki. Loki has become such an iconic and beloved Marvel villain over the past decade. Again, because of the MCU, where he was also its first villain to get his own series, but that has been reaffirmed over the years by his more prominent and fleshed out appearances in all forms of media following his film debut. Which all comes together in the likely inevitability of him fulfilling his new glorious purpose of making it into Marvel vs. Capcom should the series continue. But you could figure that out yourself. What helps Loki further is how he'd have a very distinct moveset too. And I mean, really distinct. For the standard stuff, his physical attacks would have him whack or stab you with his scepter, while he uses magic for projectiles. But what gives him the potential to be unique is how he can live up to his moniker as the Trickster God. I had the idea for Loki to be a very technical character who specializes in weakening opponents through his trickery. Having moves that can lower their stats like attack and speed, setting up traps that deal damage, and deceiving opponents with his illusions to leave them wide open. Such as the idea I had for a counter where when the opponent hits him, it's revealed to be a fake who disappears, with the real Loki appearing behind them and literally stabbing them in the back. But for balancing purposes, he would have low defense, so you have more reason to not use him against Hulk. Now it's on to the Capcom newcomers. And I think the best place to start would be the Capcom character who is most likely to get added if this game were to come out in the near future. Luke. Capcom seems to like including a character from the most recent Street Fighter into most of these games, like how Crimson Viper was playable and free. And I'm sure that if Infinite's roster was bigger, they would have added a newcomer from 5 too. So as Street Fighter 6 is coming, and will be out by the time this game would be in development if it happens soon, it's likely they'd add a newcomer from that game as one here. And as Luke is pretty much the main character of 6, he makes the most sense. Well, he did first appear as DLC in 5, but that was done purely as a teaser for what was to come. For all intents and purposes, he's a 6 character first. If anything, his appearance in 5 just made him more famous than he'd already be, making him more likely too. Plus, he'd be super easy to implement. Just give him his moveset from 6 and you're good to go. Even his super moves already look like hyper combos. They could also incorporate subtle nods to 6's new gameplay mechanics into parts of his and the other Street Fighter characters' movesets, just like what his moveset in 5 was designed to do. This is all kind of a marketing tool, which I normally don't like when characters are added for that reason, but if executed right, it at least won't feel like one. Conversely, to go from a recent character to one who I think is being quite overdue here, Leon. Due to how successful Resident Evil is, it's understandable that it would get some notable presence in a Capcom crossover game. And Leon is one of the most popular characters in the series, in part because of him starring in its 2 most beloved and popular games. Yet he has never made it into any Capcom Vs game. But after how big the Resident Evil 2 remake was, and with the remake of 4 on its way, I think the stars have aligned to give Leon his best shot at making the jump. Obviously he plays similar to Chris, but with his own weapons to differentiate from him, those being the weapons he obtains in 2 and 4. And maybe 6 if they wanted to reference that game for some reason. You've got the typical guns, the knife for close range slashes, and the parries featured in the 4 remake, complete with the roundhouse kicks. But he also has the more out there weapons, such as the chemical flamethrower to deal continuous damage, multiple rocket launchers and grenades for various ranged explosives, and for one of his hyper combos, he'd use the PRL 412 to fire a barrage of laser beams across the screen. Leon definitely has the potential for his own fun playstyle. So Capcom, if you're making a 4th game, put the man in already! It would make a lot of people happy! And continuing with this unintentional trend of characters with more recent popular games under their belts, Nero. After how huge of a success Devil May Cry 5 was, it seems probable that it could be featured in Marvel vs. Capcom as well, beyond just having Dante and Virgil. And Nero is the clear next character to add. And while Nero wasn't the most well-liked character in the world when he first appeared, 5 definitely changed that. Plus, there's the simple matter of just how awesome Nero's moveset could be. He already has ways to distinguish himself from his dad and uncle, like with the Red Queen's Exceed skill and Blue Rose's similar charge shots. But come on, this is DMC5 Nero we're talking about here. So he also has access to the Devil Breaker. They can feature the techniques from all the different Devil Breaker models across Nero's moves, which alone gives the developers so much material to work with so he won't be deadweight, including the Tether Grab as a means to pull opponents close to extend combos. Then they can even feature the Bringer Claws for his throws. Lastly, as one would expect, since Dante and Virgil have their Devil Triggers as hyper combos, one of Nero's hyper combos will be his full Devil Trigger transformation from the end of the game. And in his case, he'll also gain some new moves while the transformation is in effect. Then for the finishing touches, if they made his character theme a remix of Devil Trigger, the song, not the form, and changed Virgil's to Bury the Light, it would be
perfection.
So while we're on the subject of more famous Capcom franchises that feature demons, let's talk about Darkstalkers. Every Marvel vs. Capcom game adds at least one new Darkstalkers character. Even Infinite managed that. So it's highly unlikely that 4 would be an exception. And for who that new Darkstalkers character could be, it was pretty easy to decide. John Talbane. John was the most requested character from the series to appear in Infinite up to its release. While I did prefer Dimitri making it, since I'm still shocked he's never appeared in this series, I've definitely warmed up to the idea of John making it in over the years. And I think he has a lot more going for him too. Beyond just the amount of fan demand he has, his moveset would also stand out a lot more compared to Dimitri's due to how agile and acrobatic he is, with moves that are not really present across the rest of the cast. This is another case of just porting over his moveset practically 1-to-1, with his EX moves like the big flaming dragon being reworked as his hyper combos. What's more is that I think John has much more potential with interactions with other characters outside of his series. His whole storyline is him trying to control his werewolf powers to prevent himself from going feral and harming innocent people. Where have I heard that before? So with all these factors put together, I don't see any good reason why John shouldn't be added if there was another game. Those were all the series that you would expect to get newcomers. Now is when I began to think a bit outside of the box and pull from more bizarre sources. Nina from Breath of Fire. This is quite the unexpected pick for me, considering I didn't even know about this series until fairly recently when I was planning this video. Breath of Fire is an old RPG series made by Capcom that started on the SNES up until its 5th game on the PS2, where it then vanished until 2016 when it got a 6th game on mobile devices that was apparently really bad and got shut down a year later. But while the series has effectively been in limbo for 20 years, Capcom haven't forgotten about it, with the biggest example being that the series and Nina herself were featured in Teppen, the weird Capcom crossover mobile game where everyone takes the Yu-Gi-Oh! Approach of solving conflicts with a trading card game. So I think it's entirely possible that a Breath of Fire character could appear in a Versus game as a sort of retro pick. Nina is the female protagonist of the series, but the Nina who appears in each game is a different person who just happens to have the same name, in a similar case to Link. For this game, I'm using Breath of Fire Free Nina, as that was the one who appeared in Teppen. But for her moveset, she can take influence from all the Ninas, and even have the others appear as alternate costumes. Since she often plays like the typical RPG mage, she has many magic spells of varying elements to use as another zoner, with a few physical attacks using a rapier like the first game's Nina. I also had an idea for one of her assists to be her casting a healing spell on the active character to recover their health, but give it a long cooldown before it can be used again. Then whatever is considered her strongest spell in the series could be used for her level 3 hyper combo. Now we are going to go even further outside the box until it is miles away. Cause if you think that was an unexpected pick, you ain't seen nothing yet. Devilot. Another recurring trend in the series is to add an extremely weird character. So to fulfill that role, I scoured all over the place, looking for the most random and weirdest potential newcomer that no one else has thought of, and I failed. But I stuck with Devilot because I think she is perfect for that part. For what supports her chances on top of being one of, if not the most bizarre character Capcom has ever created. Princess Devilot de Death Satan the Ninth, yes, that is her full name, is a character from Cyberbots, the same game that Jin's from, where she's one of the villains, acting as a space pirate in her mech, the Super 8, which is a giant robot octopus. This little girl, with a cliché princess look, is a supervillain with an almost psychotic personality and a mech. Recently, Cyberbots was one of the games featured in the Capcom Fighting Collection, somewhat bringing it back into the spotlight. And while Jin is the protagonist, Devilot has actually made a couple of appearances in other Capcom games, so one could argue that Devilot is more iconic than Jin because of this. Someone at Capcom certainly seems to have a soft spot for her. Then for how she'd play, the characters in Cyberbots fight exclusively in their mechs, while that is not the case here. But if they can do that with Jin, they can do the same with her. And she has a lot of room for such a wacky moveset, with her two henchmen, Dave the Scientist and Xavier the Wizard, doing most of the heavy lifting, similar to Maya with Phoenix, whilst also having moves where the Super 8 launches attacks from off-screen like missiles and lasers. The same applying to her hyper combos, where one, again like Jin's, has one of the Super 8's tentacles thrust forward while acting like a drill. And her level 3 has the opponent get trapped in the Super 8's tractor beam where they are then blown up. But really, I think the most fun that would come from Devilot's inclusion is how funny it would be to see her alongside all the other villains. Imagine seeing her next to Dr. Doom. And now, it is time for the final Capcom and final newcomer overall in the base game. Asura. More to be expected here, as Asura was the most requested Capcom character to appear in Infinite. Even I wanted him for how powerful he is. Being able to take down beings larger than planets and killing all the Hindu/Buddhist gods, including the god of his universe. So the prospects of him going up against the Marvel powerhouses would lead to some absurdly destructive battles. In cinematics, since we can't replicate that in normal gameplay, but it would be cool to think about nonetheless. Thanks to the DLC in Asura's Wrath having Asura fight Ryu and Akuma in Street Fighter's format, there's already a base idea for how he could play in a 2D fighting game, which they can then build upon by adding his attacks from the game's cinematic moments, which is mainly a lot of rapid punches like a stand rush. I also thought of giving him a unique mechanic by carrying over the burst gauge. Here, Asura landing attacks causes the gauge to increase, where after it rises past certain points, he grows more arms, thus making his attacks do more damage and deal more hits for higher combos. But when he gets hit, the gauge decreases, and if he takes too much damage, he loses those additional arms and has to work it up again to get them back. And once the gauge is full, he gets access to his level 3 hyper combo, when he attacks you in his berserk state before hitting you with the punch he used to kill Chakravartin. And given his origin and how much work you have to go through to use this move, it seems fair to make this one of the strongest hyper combos in the whole game. But it fully depletes the burst gauge afterwards. The only thing that hurts Asura's chances of getting in is that Asura's Wrath is a decade old, was a one-off game, and hasn't been referenced elsewhere save for a costume in Street Fighter V. Similar reasons were why some other Capcom characters who are often requested sadly didn't make the cut. But I think what Asura has going for him over them is that the sheer amount of requests he's gotten may be enough for Capcom to notice and add him regardless. It's a big gamble on my end, but if landed the right way, the results would be spectacular. So that is the entire base roster over and done with, which would hopefully look a lot more attractive to fans and average players than Infinite's, alongside ideally better graphics, music, story, and so on. But there is one person who is still unaccounted for. Who is the final boss? That is actually an important question, because with the exception of Abyss in 2, the final boss has always been a Marvel villain, or half of one in Infinite's case, so it's safe to say they probably won't change that. I considered having Kang take this position, since he's the new big bad of the MCU, but I didn't want this game to be entirely focused on the MCU with its new content, and for it to be more interesting to use someone else. I've seen this idea come up here and there, but once I realized the full extent of what could be done with it, I decided to use it too. The final boss is the Beyonder. He is a lesser-known Marvel character who sometimes acts as a villain and belongs to a race of beings who live outside the multiverse and possess nigh omnipotent power. He is one of the most powerful characters in all of Marvel Comics, setting a pretty daunting tone as the final boss, where his superpower being near omnipotence gives the developers the opportunity to come up with whatever they want for his attacks. However, the biggest draw of using the Beyonder is what he can do for this game's story. He is most famous for being behind the Secret Wars storyline, an event that will become way more famous in 4 years' time. I had this idea since before Comic-Con, so that was purely a coincidence. There, he abducted characters from across the Marvel universe to a planet called Battleworld, where they were forced to fight each other. And this storyline seemed to be so good that they did it 3 times! The most recent involving characters from across the multiverse. You've probably connected the dots by now. My idea for this game's story is for it to be an adaptation of Secret Wars. Just replace the multiverse variants with Capcom characters, whilst taking some of the background material from the first Secret Wars and having the Beyonder play a more villainous role like in the second one. So here's the overview of what I had in mind. The Beyonder abducts the Marvel and Capcom characters to Battleworld, which in this version, much like how it was in the 2015 one, is like a pocket dimension made up of a mishmash of recreated locations from the fighters' home universes, which makes up the game's stages. The two sides are forced to fight each other, where whichever side wins will have their world spared from destruction, and the specific last person standing will have whatever they desire granted. It starts with an all-out brawl between both sides, but after the initial confrontation dies down, many people start forming factions, either to help their chances of winning, or to find an alternate solution to stopping all this. Meanwhile, the villains focus solely on defeating everyone else so they can use the Beyonder's power to fulfill their own ambitions. Eventually, after all the villains have been defeated, and it's only the heroes left who now choose to no longer fight each other, it forces the Beyonder to become directly involved, where they can now take the fight straight to him, leading to his boss fight, the same as it will be at the end of arcade mode. And for his second phase, where you have to fight something way bigger, he summons and takes control of a Celestial, forcing you to fight that as well. Once he's defeated, it brings an end to this secret war, and all the characters are safely returned home as the heroes from both sides now have a newfound respect for one another. The end. A pretty simple premise overall, but one that I think takes full advantage of the entire concept behind Marvel vs. Capcom. Least of all, we'll actually get to see the characters properly meet each other and see how their interactions develop throughout the narrative, hopefully feel less like we're meandering about the majority of the time, and get a satisfying conclusion, the absence of which were all issues I had with Infinite's story. Additionally, the Secret Wars approach helped to establish several other ideas for this game, one of which that I touched on before being the stages. So I think this is the right time to quickfire through all the stage concepts I thought of. There is a new version of Avengers Tower, the Danger Room, the Sanctum Sanctorum with apparitions of other dimensions forming the background, a new version of Asgard, Wakanda, Castle Doom, Nowhere, or Anywhere in Space for the Guardians, Metro City as it appears in Street Fighter VI, the Temple of Ascension, Central Highway, the Umbrella Facility, Makai, the Clyphot, Astera, and the Beyonders Plane of Existence exclusively for the final battle. And the other idea I got from this was the only thing I could think of for modes aside from the standard versus, arcade, online, training, challenges, and shop one would typically expect. Similar in concept to the Heroes and Heralds mode in Free, I thought of an online mode simply called Marvel vs. Capcom. Following the Beyonders' plans, this mode would last over a certain time frame, like a week for example. And when selected, you are given the option to choose either Marvel or Capcom. And whichever side you pick, you can only select characters from that side, and are then pitted against players online who chose the other side. Once the time frame is over, whichever side got more wins is the overall winner, and those who selected it gain some reward like a large amount of in-game currency for the shop. Then the cycle repeats, where you can then reselect which side to play as. That's everything that would be present in the game at launch. Now it's time to go over the DLC. With the one and only, but most important content in this section I have anything of value to discuss, being the DLC characters. For this game, I decided to add 10 additional characters, split evenly between both companies, so we don't get a repeat of this, with the intention of having these characters be gradually released in pairs, one Marvel, one Capcom, until we're done. And almost all of the DLC characters will be newcomers to make up for the smaller number of them present in the base roster. Once again, starting with Marvel and its first DLC character, Moon Knight. I wanted to go with a bit of a deeper cut for one of these fighters, while also being someone who could excite many, which Moon Knight provides both of after getting much more mainstream recognition and popularity thanks to his series. That was another one of the better Phase 4 projects, while having yet to appear alongside the A-listers in the MCU, which was on top of his existing popularity from the hardcore comic fans and slowly more prominent appearances in other media prior to the series. I was debating between him and Daredevil here, but I went with Moon Knight because I had an idea for his moveset that I think would make him slightly more interesting to play. He could be like one of those stance characters, but have him switching stances be him shifting between his multiple personalities. Then for each personality, they'd have different moves and properties that would reflect their behavior. Like Mark could be the balanced one, Steven could be the fastest, and Jake could be the hardest hitting. This does contradict some versions of the comics that have the Moon Knight alter ego be its own personality too, but I think we can have some creative liberty, and I think it's such an interesting idea for a moveset that simultaneously highlights why Moon Knight is such an interesting character, when otherwise he could end up just being like a typical brawler. Then add in a Mr. Knight alternate costume for extra fan service. Also, his first appearance in the comics had him fight against Werewolf by Night, and we already have a werewolf in this game. So there's a self-writing interaction straight away. Then for the second character, Green Goblin. Surprisingly, despite being Marvel's most famous hero, there are hardly any Spider-Man characters in Marvel vs. Capcom. We've only ever had Spidey and Venom. So I'd say it's time to fix that by adding his arch enemy. Plus, he certainly has the material for a unique moveset to further justify his inclusion. One that revolves around his glider. He'd spend the entirety of the fight on the glider, giving him better aerial mobility than the average fighter, and having his moves be composed of the glider's weaponry with some pumpkin bombs thrown in here and there, as well as just straight up ramming or slicing you with it, and dropping people from heights. There could be an issue with this approach, however, as I recall hearing that they planned to include Silver Surfer in Free, but scrapped him because they had trouble animating him riding his surfboard. But with Green Goblin, not only is his glider way shorter in length than the board, so it should be easier to animate, but even if it was too difficult, he could still work in a different way by having him on the ground, and instead using the glider like a drone, making him more of a puppet character. It would be less ideal this way, but it would still allow him to be unique. Just be careful where you aim it.
Oh.
Next, Scarlet Witch. She came up in my old and bad Infinite videos too, but even then I thought suggesting her was a big stretch. But nowadays, with how many Wanda stans there are, in addition to her becoming more popular in general, it definitely raises the likelihood of her making it in. But as always, gameplay is most important, and Wanda has that in spades. With the powers of reality manipulation, hexes, and chaos magic at her disposal, she too has near infinite possibilities for moves, which I mainly envision involving the use of a bunch of magical projectiles, altering reality to mess with you and your opponent's placements on the stage as just one example of how that can be used, and even a move or hyper combo where she creates a hex that forms an area of continuous damage to the opponent while they are in that area. And a possibility I thought of for her level 3 is a reference to the No More Mutant spell from House of M that erases the opponent's active character from existence if the move kills them. Plus, her flipping between being a hero or villain, even in the comics, gives her a lot of opportunities for interactions with the other Marvel characters, hopefully executing her character much better than in Multiverse of Madness. Sadly, Marvel kinda fucked up her potential interactions with Magneto after the stupid retcon of her and Quicksilver not being his kids anymore, just because they were salty over Fox at the time. At least there's something still there, I guess. Moving on to the fourth fighter, Magic. Like with Shang-Chi, she was someone who I'd never heard of prior to her getting a sort of big break when she appeared in New Mutants. Even though that film sucked, and she was kind of a bitch in it, I thought she had the coolest powers out of them all. And it seems the film somehow did more good than harm since over the many years it took to release, and afterwards, she's been given bigger roles in the comics and a growing fanbase to boot. She even appeared in that Midnight Suns game. Combine that with how cool her powers and her storyline seem to be, and she could be another very unexpected but still fun inclusion. Her mutant ability is teleportation, so she'd obviously have teleporting moves, but she specifically teleports to a hell-like dimension called Limbo, where she is its sorceress supreme. Thus, she can also use magic. It's kind of in the name, but an extremely vast array of magic abilities which include those not present with the other magic users here, providing all sorts of options for physical, ranged, and defensive moves using this magic. But most of all, Limbo gave her access to the Soul Sword, which is normally depicted in the comics as this big Buster Sword-like weapon, meaning she'd primarily have heavy sword swing attacks akin to Gamora's big sword attacks in Infinite. So in the end, she'd be a sword fighter on the heavier side, with her teleportation and sorcery giving her a ton of variety in her moveset. As part of further wanting to not have this game be solely dependent on the MCU, I wanted to add a newcomer who has nothing to do with the MCU at the minute or in the foreseeable future. And with Magic's growing presence in the X-Men and New Mutants, I felt she was one of the best candidates for that. And for the final Marvel DLC character, the Return of Sentinel! One issue I noticed with the roster so far is that it is a little lacking in heavyweights. And I did have a few ideas for new heavy Marvel characters in consideration, like Luke Cage, Hercules, and even Apocalypse. But I went with bringing back Sentinel instead because along with being amongst the candidates with more variety in moves, he's such a fan-favorite character in this series. Despite being essentially a glorified mook, players of 2 and 3 fell in love with him because of the way he plays. After feeling kinda bad for leaving him out of the base game, I saw the situation as the perfect chance to make that right. But like with many of the other returning characters, there would be a few tweaks to him here and there, such as making him a little slower for more balance, while still maintaining what people liked about his playstyle in the first place. And this helps to include another character who has nothing to do with the MCU right now. So it looks like a win all around the board. Now to finish this off with Capcom's DLC characters. First up, coming out of the blue, Date Masamune. Someone who will be unheard of to the majority of people watching this, he is from the series Sengoku Basara, which is basically Capcom's take on a Musou game that is loosely based on Japanese history and is super popular and successful in Japan and other Asian countries, having been adapted into a bunch of other media, yet has never made it into a versus game before. This choice was made specifically with the Japanese audience in mind, as I've noticed that Japanese fighting game developers tend to include at least one character that appeals a lot to their country's player base. Plus, Sengoku Basara does have a small yet devoted following in the West, so it's not like only the Japanese players will enjoy his inclusion. Even though the series hasn't had a mainline game since 2015, like with Breath of Fire, it was featured in Teppen, meaning it's still on Capcom's radar. Oichi was the character they used to rep the series there, and I did consider using her for the spot for that reason, but she mainly fights with these ghost hands, which are already kind of present in bits of Nero and Jetta's movesets, so I thought she'd have trouble standing out. So I went with Date instead because he's one of the main characters in the series. At this point, I was starting to get worried that this game has too many sword fighters, until I remembered, that's a shit argument! As long as the character can play differently enough, it shouldn't matter what weapon they use. And as Date is a samurai, who historically used a very different style of sword combat compared to other sword fighters, alongside having multi-sword wielding moves and his own elemental abilities of electricity and ice in one game, he can play differently enough. I'm ashamed for almost falling for the Smash fanbase's dumb, hypocritical logic. Beyond that, developing him shouldn't be hard since they can just translate his moveset from the series into 2D space. And one of his hyper combos can have him switch to his 6-sword mode where he uses all of his katanas like discount Wolverine claws, allowing his moves to deal multiple hits per attack to accumulate more damage and combo counts. Second, for another welcome surprise pick, Vile. Infinite was very kind to the X series, and since Mega Man is being treated much better by Capcom these days, I could see them adding another X character. It's a toss-up between Vile and Axel for who would come next, and on top of being featured more often in series and elsewhere than Axel, I simply think Vile would have a more interesting moveset. Sorry Axel. They can give Vile many of his attacks from his boss fights as moves, mainly blasts from his shoulder cannon, with a stronger laser beam one for a hyper combo, and leg bombs in some of his aerial moves. Then they could go further and give him his weapons and abilities he gets from when he was playable in Maverick Hunter X, like the Vulcans for standard combos, missiles for heavy attacks, and his other cannon weapons for anti-airs, just to name a few. Then his level 3 would be a cinematic where he busts out the ride armor to pummel you into the ground. Despite not needing much explanation since the gameplay does most of the talking, it shows that Vile could actually work really well in the versus game, even though no one else has fought of him to my knowledge. Even when they're in a different dimension, he can still come back to haunt X all over again. Next up, and a little more predictable here, Akira. Getting the obvious out of the way, since she appeared as DLC in Street Fighter V, she got a massive boost in popularity, especially to those outside of the rival school's fanbase who then became much more familiar with her, making her arguably the most iconic rival school's character due to getting that big breakout appearance. So I could see her riding that wave of newfound popularity into Marvel vs. Capcom. But what made me fully decide on adding her was how she's been stuck in this always the bridesmaid, never the bride position when it comes to Capcom's crossovers. She was planned to appear in that Capcom Fighting All-Stars game that got cancelled, and she was even considered for Infinite, but didn't make the cut, which may have been a good thing in the long term. And all that was before she even made it into Street Fighter. So now that she's become way more famous through it, she could finally get her chance. I intend for her to be more of a rival school's rep than a Street Fighter one, but she could act as both in a way. And they can carry over a lot of what they did to translate her moves for Street Fighter to here. I can see all the air combos now. But for her level 3, I thought of making it a recreation of the combination attacks from Project Justice to be more of a rival school specific reference. And this kind of goes without saying, but she would have her full biker or powered Akira getup as an alternate costume, complete with the Easter egg of having her act tough when she's wearing it. For the 4th Capcom edition, Ada Wong. I highly doubt that Capcom would keep Resident Evil at 2 characters, so I'm thinking of someone else who's new to join them. Ada just seemed to work the best when Leon is already here, due to her connection to him, while still having her own independent qualities that are similar to why I included Leon in the first place, as well as her mysteriousness for how that can be written into her interactions and arcade mode ending. But for her gameplay, she can be given a lot of weaponry she can obtain in the Mercenaries mode throughout the series, with some creative liberty of also giving her a few more of the military-grade weapons to fit her role as a spy. And of course, that crossbow she's often depicted with, probably for hyper combos. Combine all that with making her more on the nimble side, reminiscent of Jill's playstyle in Free, without all the crawling, then she can definitely play differently to Leon despite both of their movesets being pulled from near identical sources. And now, the last DLC character of them all. Tessa from Red Earth. Weird note to end on, I know. Red Earth is an old Capcom fighting game that also used RPG mechanics, which kind of faded into obscurity over the years until it was also featured in the Capcom Fighting Collection to give it a bit more prominence again. But the game was referenced quite a number of times here and there in that gap, which is where Tessa comes into play, as out of the 4 playable characters from Red Earth, she had some of the most frequent appearances in this regard and got to be playable in 2 other games, whereas all the others who got to be playable elsewhere only did so once. Along with being the character I see brought up most often when I hear this game mentioned, Tessa just seems to be the most famous one in general. So with what I believe would be the strong likelihood of a Red Earth character making it into a versus game if one happens soon as a result of the collection, Tessa would make the most sense. What also helps is that she has by far the most original and expansive moveset of the entire playable cast. Being the mage character of this game, she gets so many spells as she levels up. And I'm starting to realize I shouldn't have been worried about too many sword fighters, but rather too many sorcerers. But like with magic, her spells are very different to a lot of what the other sorcerers have, along with different applications of how she uses them. Like, one of her super moves has her summon a cannon that can shoot either a fire, ice, or thunder spell, which could be made into one of her hyper combos that fires all 3 simultaneously instead. Other than that, just copy her moveset from Red Earth. It's underwhelming for it to be that simple for the final character, but it's what works the best. And with that, we have the final complete roster. Now with 58 characters, and 21 of them being newcomers, which is just over a third, which I think is a fairer ratio. While it was very hard to try to predict the unpredictability that's present with Marvel vs. Capcom's roster, I think I got maybe a 50% accuracy rate, at best. It's on the verge of tragedy that infinite mistakes leading to the game's inevitable failure means that something like this never seeing the light of day is a more likely outcome than anything I've come up with for this video. I think the series can do so much more. So many more characters from both companies that would be really good additions. So many more stages to display. So many more boss fights they could do. So many extra modes they could make. So much awesome music they can remix. So much fan service they can capitalize on with these worlds collided. And we'll probably never get to see that. This was just a glimpse of one idea, albeit one with similarities to many others, of what we could see if Marvel and Capcom were willing to give this another shot. But as we all hold on to that hope that this unlikely event will happen, we just have to keep moving on and see what the future holds in store for us. Wow, I did not intend for that to sound so dramatic.